Are you willing to accept Christ's invitation to know Him more intimately, love Him more intensely, and follow Him more closely, and then go out into the world and live His good news? If you say yes, then you could be the 13th apostle. Join Dan Duddy and Tom Caffrey, the odd couple of Catholic radio, as they ride the radio waves 2 by 2 to share the goodness, beauty, and truth of Jesus Christ and His church. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the 13th apostle.
Many of us are old enough to remember the day in 1979 when Americans in their embassy in Iran were taken hostage, and the subsequent days, months, and more than a year of yellow ribbons around the country, and one commentary after another about what we should do, failed rescue mission. And it seems that at that time, either the demonization or the self-demonization, maybe both, began between the United States of America and the Muslim world. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of the 13th Apostle, where we explore the good, beautiful, and true of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church. This is Tom Caffrey, and I do remember that day. I remember the hoods that were placed over the American hostages. And from that point on, anything Muslim, anything Islam was bad. And we're dealing with it today with the war in Iran. So I've asked once again my good friend Dave Pinault to join me in a conversation of this topic and his insights, because he is an Islamic scholar, a faithful Catholic. That's a unique combination in my life. Once I learned about Dave's background, I was really interested in having not just one thorough conversation about this subject matter. We've had Dave on before Dan retired, and we had an episode, a great discussion about his fantasy, his Catholic fantasy of Earth Dragon Run, published by Ignatius Press. So we're glad to welcome Dave back to discuss some of his other works. So how are you doing?
Doing fine, thank you. And it's a real privilege to be back and have a conversation with you again.
First, tell us about how you, as a faithful Catholic, have devoted so much of your life to Islam.
Well, I got into the interest in Islam partly through an interest in languages and partly through an interest in archaeology. I remember when I was 9 years old, I was in the neighborhood drugstore pharmacy with my dad, and I spotted on the spinner rack a paperback called The How and Why Wonder Book of Lost Cities. And my dad was nice enough to get that for me. And that sort of started my interest in archaeology. Basically, that love of archaeology and the love of studying foreign languages combined, I started studying Latin and French and so forth when I was in high school. In fact, I was an altar boy at the age of 10, back when the Mass was still in Latin. So that twinned interest in archaeology and in languages sort of propelled me to an interest in the Middle East. I started graduate school actually in the field of classics in Greek and Latin. One of the projects that I undertook in graduate school, I was doing work in the field of medieval studies, a project on the Latin correspondence sent home in the 12th and 13th century by crusaders in the Holy Land. And then I wanted to kind of round out the investigation to get more perspective on the Arab Muslim side. So I started auditing courses in Arabic for fun. And at that time, there was a wonderful federal grant program, a National Defense Foreign Language Grant, which was a competitive exam. And for people who could pass the language exam, the federal government would fund your graduate level study of Arabic. And so what wound up happening was I actually wound up sort of taking a joint degree, a major concentration in Arabic and Islamic studies, but also what they call a joint designation in Latin and Greek as well. So in other words, for me, it's never been an exclusive academic focus only on Islam. What has always interested me from the start as a lifelong Catholic has been the interaction of the Catholic Christian tradition with its faith neighbors, so to speak, and other religions around the world. It's been absolutely fascinating. One thing that I've always have told my students is that the experience of living and working and studying in Islamic societies worldwide has actually deepened and strengthened my faith as a Catholic Christian.
The way you close that comment obviously makes me think of one of the topics of your study, of an introduction that you wrote in a book on Father Charles de Foucauld,
Mhm.
that you write about his, and I want you to talk about him. You write about his hedonistic lifestyle, and then you write because of his experience in Algeria, in Islamic Algeria, which last time I checked was 0.3% Christian. So not 3%. And his experience with the Islamic culture and the people of Islam sparked his reversion, that he was a revert to his Catholicism. So talk about Father Charles de Foucauld. Fascinating figure.
Yeah, yes, absolutely fascinating figure. He's someone who interests me because the fact that, like me, he started off born into the Catholic faith, but then he had an experience, like many of us do, where I think partly as a result of basically taking too much for granted, the treasure and the great privilege that is the Catholic faith. As a young man, as a teen, he kind of slid away from it. And as you mentioned, he becomes kind of a party hardy bonbon connoisseur, a hedonist, as you said. Now, what really turned his life around was, he joined the French military. He didn't do that spectacularly at Saint-Cyr. That's the French equivalent of Sandhurst in Britain, or West Point in the American Army. But when he goes to North Africa and realizes, I have a responsibility for my troops, he starts to develop, first of all, a kind of attentive discipline to taking care of the troops under his command. And then he begins to be struck by the very evident and publicly manifest faith of the Muslims in whose society he was living, not only in Algeria, but also when he traveled to Morocco. The same thing. He was not tempted to become Muslim, but it did remind him first of the presence of God, and second, of the possibility of living a life structured ritually around the response to God's presence. That ultimately led him, when he returned to France, basically to make his confession, begin taking the Eucharist again, and to begin rediscovering and reappropriating his own Catholic faith. Ultimately, that led him to become a kind of missionary and hermit priest. He became consecrated as a priest and returned to French Africa, to French Algeria. Absolutely fascinating story. I think that you may have read a paper that I gave at Christendom College, where I also talk about how inspiring Father Charles Foucauld was to a younger French contemporary, Louis Massignon, who was the greatest, I would say, certainly one of the greatest Orientalists of the 20th century, and someone who, like Father Foucauld, was born into the Catholic faith, began to slide away from it, and then through the experience of living and working professionally in Islamic countries, rediscovered his Catholic faith and sort of consecrated himself to, say, Islamic Christian dialogue throughout his life as a professional scholar of Islam. So both Massignon and Foucauld have been inspirations for me.
Talk about the hedonistic life of Father Charles. You are a professor emeritus at Santa Clara University, Jesuit college. So you have experience with young, as you write, nominally Catholic students,
Yeah.
unchurched. I don't know when you started your study and became very aware of Father Charles de Foucauld. I wonder whether either you saw then or you see now the similarities of a comfortable life, a life free of want, a life free of challenge. Father Charles didn't have a smartphone. He didn't have, a tablet, computers and whatnot, where he could just live the virtual life. We see the lack of involvement by young men over the last 50 years, or the exit of men from the pews of Catholic churches, and certainly of mainline Protestant churches.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me is, where's the mission? Where's a purpose in my life and a mission to fulfill it? So often it was join the Boy Scouts, join the military,
Mm-hmm.
okay, be on a sports team or something like that. But the religion, and you mentioned the Crusades, for centuries, as you well know, for millennia, religion had rituals, and it was purposeful. There was this telos, right? To what end are we living? And I think so many, the studies by the CDC that published, I think in 2024, showing a significant increase in suicide ideation and suicide and depression and anxiety in young people. And when you interview them, they're lost. And so I wonder whether you saw that in your students, you looked back.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say, first of all, you're picking up on something that I noted in an article of mine that I think you read recently, my review of a book by the French scholar of Islam named Gilles Kepel.
Indeed. The Terror in France.
In France, yes. He notes that with regard to Islamic militancy and terrorist activity in France, he was shocked to find up to 30% or more of the recruits to ISIS, the Islamic State, in France, up to 30% or more are what are known as Français de souche, which means French citizens who are from French ethnic white backgrounds, not just disaffected ethnic Arabs in France. And that interested me and disturbed me. Of course, the challenge in France is somewhat analogous to what you have here. You have a large number of people who come from nominally Christian, Catholic backgrounds, but who are, as you mentioned, completely unchurched. They know just enough about Christianity to dismiss it with contempt as something they had the vaguest notion of from childhood. They think they know all about it, when in fact they know almost nothing. But they're already bored with it prematurely. They toss it aside. Now, my experience is this. I'm a Catholic. My professional area is Arabic and Islamic Studies. So in teaching courses on Islam, as with other world religions I've taught, involving Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and so forth. What I would do always would be to make a point of taking students to local places of worship associated with the faith tradition we're studying, so that students can have the direct personal close-up experience of seeing the rituals, meeting people of the given faith community, and having the chance during and after the service to interact with practitioners and to talk to worshipers to get a sense from them of what it means to them as insiders to the faith. What does it mean to belong to that faith, such as Islam? And I would do that consciously because of the fact that I myself am not a Muslim. I myself am a Catholic Christian. Of course, there are certain risks involved with that. And the big risk is that many, if not most, of the students that I would have in my classes would be thoroughly unchurched, unhoused students, young undergrads from only a nominally Christian background. They were in my classes because Santa Clara University, as a Jesuit university, requires students to take, depending on which program they're in, at least 2 or 3 religious studies courses. And very often, they would deliberately choose religion courses having as little, so they think, having as little as possible to do with Christianity. And they would admit this because I always have the students do a little essay first day of class, describing themselves and their interests, gives me a chance to get a sense of them and their writing style. So it turns out that these students who have really had no experience of faith life at all, they go to the mosque, the Islamic place of worship with me, and it's the first time in their life that they have seen collective ritual in action. And they are often very impressed and awestruck. Add to that the imams, the prayer leaders at the mosque, even though I explained to them that, this is a scholarly enterprise and so forth, and the preachers, the imams would say, oh yeah, we get it. Nonetheless, they couldn't resist proselytizing my students while we're at the mosque. And there's a sense in which there's a certain vulnerability in play there.
Were you acting like the lifeguard, so to speak, so they don't get in over their heads in the deep water?
Very good question. I don't want to be rude and interrupt the imams and so forth and get into a big public disagreement with them. But nonetheless, I would take note of the fact that, the students are being proselytized, and they themselves, the students, are very impressionable. And they would tell me afterwards, how awestruck they were by seeing an assembly of people all bowing and praying, prostrating themselves and reciting the prayers in Arabic. And keep in mind, Arabic is not the native language for the majority of Muslims in the world. So the vast majority of Muslims worldwide are not ethnic Arabs. And so it's a lot of work for them to learn the responses in Arabic, comparable, say, to when you and I were growing up learning the Mass in Latin. The students were very impressed. And that began to affect very early on how I would structure the course. I persisted in doing the field trips, but I would provide more preparation, and the the first thing I would do, and I made this a career-long habit, the first day of the quarter, I would tell my students, without anyone asking, although I knew they were curious because students would follow up on this later, I would tell the students, I'm a professional in the field of Arabic and Islamic Studies, but I'm a lifelong Catholic. Part of what we will be exploring in this course is not simply the data, theological data, historical data, etc., concerning the given religion we're studying. But we're going to explore questions like, is it possible to be a thinking, educated person in the 21st century and be religious, be spiritual, and even more shockingly, be a faithfully practicing Catholic Christian? Students over the years, both in office hour discussions and in the written evaluations that they would submit at the end of the quarter, would say to me how shocked they were to find out that, wow, this guy, he's a professor, but he's someone who not only is a Catholic, but he takes it seriously as an adult. And a lot of students would tell me later on that this was a real challenge to them because they came into the class with so many prejudices, not just against religion, which many of them had, but prejudices against the Catholic faith. What I would try to do is, no matter what religion I was teaching, whether it was Islam, but also other world religions I would teach, I would frame it in such a way that the given discussion was not just about the data points, as important as they are, the history of the faith and what do adherents of Islam and so forth believe, but the larger question of what does it mean when we talk about things like the transcendent? What does it mean to be a spiritually oriented person? What does it mean to move beyond vague spirituality to adherence to a faith tradition? And thereby stimulate in the students curiosity in the most constructive way about the possibility of a faith life, and then also the possibility of rediscovering the Catholic faith they thought they knew all about and had discarded with childhood. And we would build up that discussion throughout the quarter so that by the time we would get to the mosque, the students would be better equipped to have a fuller perspective of what they were experiencing. And then, although, as I said, I would, try to avoid, getting into an unconstructive quarrel with our hosts, I would always do a kind of debriefing afterwards, because every student was also required to keep a journal. So they paid attention and took notes on what they experienced and talked about. We'd do a debriefing afterwards and have something to eat and so forth. Bring up the students' questions. Was there anything that they found particularly attractive, anything troubling, etc., and build out a good conversation from that. Again, so that we're not just learning data points, but I'm inviting students to rediscover their own spiritual interiority and the possibility of nurturing a relationship with God.
You're probably one of the few, if not the only, Catholic men that these students faithful Catholic, an active practicing Catholic man in their lives. I'm sure that they saw these I don't know, dozens of men of the Islamic faith in their prayer in unison. It can be very powerful. They haven't had any experience like that. This is part of the problem, not just from the standpoint of religion, but of the traditions that every culture has had, more so for men, for males, because of leader, provider, protector, and whatnot, of the tribe, of the village, or whatnot. You go out and hunt, the Maasai warrior, to teach what do you bring back to the community. So this is how you become a man. These are the steps that you become a man. These are the rituals that are time tested. I don't want to say we've lost that as a culture. We have given that up. We gave it up before the smartphone.
Yeah.
But you can get presumably any question answered in the smartphone. You just can't do. I've said this a few times to people I know. The young people will be looking for that app on their phone about how to plunge a toilet. Like, why won't this phone plunge the toilet? Sometimes you have to grab that tool. And that's, the saying now is touch grass.
Yeah.
So to have a man in their life, again, I'm saying man only from the standpoint of what we typically see with Islamic men images. It's only men that are in the mosque that are praying, and could be hundreds in some of the mosques. And again, it's a powerful experience, and we want to be part of something, as the saying goes, bigger than ourselves. But society is not, or the culture is not allowing us to have that. And that's why when you said they were vaguely spiritual, that doesn't get you through a cold winter's night.
Yeah.
The spiritual but not religious. I'm spiritual but not religious. It's almost like I thought with your time in Islamic countries, you open your review of the book, you're talking about your experience in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And, I made a hand-to-mouth living playing music in a restaurant on the coast of Normandy. And the guitarist I performed with was an Algerian Muslim from Paris. And I thought, "Well, that's like a romantic image of bygone days." I know how you conclude your review of the book and then your other paper, how, that re-Christianizing contemporary culture. Doctor, you are a doctor. So doctor, what is your prescription?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous challenge. Part of the solution is something that interests both of us, the idea of mentorship and the idea that there is wisdom, potentially, we older men have at our disposal to share with younger people. And this is where, at the parish level, of course, there can be opportunities for this. As an educator, for many years, I came to realize early on that, in a way, the content material of what I had to offer in each course was, in a way, ancillary or secondary and to the kind of moral or spiritual formation that I would hope to be able to provide, even if obliquely, in terms of a prescription. When it comes to spiritual development, it takes place both individually and collectively. As a teacher, what I would try to do to be available to my students, since some students will not take the initiative, say, to go to office hours on their own individually to do follow-up questions, it was actually a good thing that I had the requirement of these collective field trips. Everybody in the course was required to go on these field trips. And these were all outside class hours, by the way. The students knew in advance, if they signed up for my course, I was claiming a half a dozen of their weekends. So they would know that in advance. And what I would do is I would schedule a whole bunch of these trips. I would attend every one of the field trips. The students didn't have to go on all of them. They would have to go on at least 3 or 4 or whatever. It was very time consuming for me, obviously, because each teaching quarter, there was nothing else that I did but teach. But it was well worth it. For me, the sort of formula I developed was organize group activities that would catch students up and give them both the pleasure and the kind of comfort zone of being with a group of their peers being led by me on the field trip. And then at the same time, make room for what I call the Nicodemus moments, where any student who wants to follow up, and this of course would not be required, could then, ask, hey, could we meet and I'd just like to talk with you about the Catholic faith. And I would say that in one way or another, what a lot of the conversations circled around, the students would come to me and basically, I'm not using their words, but the question that they really had was, they would basically register, they were kind of shocked and surprised, though in a good way, to meet an adult man, a professional, who could say, yes, I'm a Catholic. Catholicism is not just for very young children. Catholicism is really meant for adults to get us through the great challenge that we call human life. That interested them. I realized, I have lots of great stories about experiences I've had overseas, but I would say the single most shocking and interesting one is the fact that, my gosh, this professor, he can stand up there in front of the classroom and say, yeah, I'm a Catholic. And that interested them a lot. The prescription has to do with our being available for younger people to have contact with so that they can have these kinds of questions that they need answered, availability, and then structuring activities that make it possible for them to, as I said, do things as a group so they feel safe, if you know what I mean. Because a lot of people would be uncomfortable of seeking you out one-to-one to start with, okay? But do some group activity that gets them interested and knowing religion is something that's okay to be thinking about, to be spending your time on, and to ask questions about. And I would always use the opportunity in one form or another to say to them, actually, your faith life is not just like an extra added to life. It's at the core of life, and it's the core of what is going to get you through all the challenges of life. And I would always say to them in class that if you feel like you don't need religion and you're perfectly happy the way you are, my parents love me and everything's good and I'm well provided for, I don't need a faith life, then I would say, I have just 2 words for you: just wait. Because you will be experiencing, we all do, darker moments in life, and you need that spiritual resource at the center.
Yeah, especially young, college-age students so often think they're invincible. Serious illness or death is so unlikely or off in the distance. I don't need to get into the spiritual, or if I do, not something about which I have to change. If I'm comfortable, I know that Christ makes demands. I know that Christ wants us to change our lives. It's maybe interesting to know about something, but you only know something by experience. And that's when you can say you know it as opposed to knowing about it. If they know going into the class, which they do, and you've made it clear that they do, going into the course, they just won't just be learning about, they'll have more of a sensory experience by going to the mosque. Or, okay, how about we go to a church too? When was the last time you were at church at a mass, or when was the last time you experienced the sacrament? There are surveys out now that over the last in the year, comparing from this time last year, bishops in many dioceses around the country are reporting a significant increase in young people either coming to the faith for the first time or committing themselves to it. A fair number of that is coming by way of the Latin Mass. Mm-hmm. What's often known as the traditional Latin Mass. It's not enough to reverse those who are exiting the church, but before this year, it was both. There were relatively few coming into the church, and there were many leaving. And so far, over the last year and a half, that seems to be changing. My hope is that there are more adults in the room that are like you, if I may say so, like myself, and any of the men that are listening to this program that say, okay, well, this is how we can do, as what you said, Dave, is to mentor.
Well, I'd say, first of all, that in a way, there are many different starting points for how one can develop one's faith. One challenge I have had, sometimes talking with conservative-minded Catholics, is they'll say to me, well, I don't know if I should be exposing my child to, say, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, whatever, because, that may distract them or pull them away. And my answer would be, look, if that is the thing that they're interested in at the moment, it may be possible to take that interest and extract from it the pith, really the heart of the matter, that unconscious desire for the transcendent. If a world religion, non-Christian religion, if it's taught in the right way, and this is what I've spent a lot of my life trying to do, it can guide us back into the Catholic Christian faith the same way that Charles Foucauld and Louis Massignon rediscovered their own Catholic faith by immersion in the world of Islam. So sometimes things that are strange and that seem threatening can actually, through God's grace, be a way to lead us back into the heart of the Catholic faith that you and I love so much.
A great point. Dave Pinault, author of Earth, Dragon, Run, and our friends out there, we're going to have Dave back later in June to talk about his book, The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch. I look forward to that discussion. I've been reading that book, and it's very interesting. So, Dave, thanks so much for being part of the 13th Apostle again. Always good to talk with you.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much, Tom.
Stay tuned, friends, for The Angelus, followed by Your Prayer Intentions with Peter and Jemmy, WQPH Radio. Thanks for your support, friends. We look forward to the next conversation. God bless all.
Thank you for listening to the 13th Apostle with Dan Duddy and Tom Caffrey. For more information on Dan, visit his website at www.danduddy.com or email dcduddy@gmail.com. Tom's website is faithpilgrims.com or email trcaffrey@faithpilgrims.com. How about you? Will you be the 13th Apostle?